Hi, my name is Andrew Sears, and I'm the president of City University, and I'm recording this talk for the Citygate Network CEO Summit. Before I get started on this talk, so this talk is going to be focused on organizational culture and the next generation of leaders, and I'll expand a little more on what I mean by that. But before I talk about that, I wanted to share a little of my own story of how I got involved in urban ministry, because I think it shows some of the generational transitional issues that many CEOs of ministries and rescue missions are facing. So in 92, whenever I was 19, I joined the summer staff at City Union Mission in Kansas City. And the real reason why I was there is because I had read the Bible and I was looking for God, but a lot of the Christians I knew growing up were abusive. So I figured, if anyone was doing what was in the Bible, it was those at the rescue missions. So for the first time in my life, I met loving Christians that were actually following what was in the Bible, and it changed my life. A little bit before that, so I grew up in the hood in Kansas City in a crazy neighborhood where I felt weird because I was one of the few people who wasn't having sex and doing drugs in elementary school. In high school, I worked at a Burger King that was essentially a drug house where the employees were doing meth and dealing drugs. But my drug of choice was workaholism. My workaholism took me to go to grad school at MIT. And while I was there, I co-founded a research group with one of the fathers of the internet. I had a .com startup. I became a consultant. And I was, living large, but ultimately had a life burnout from all the workaholism and realized my heart was for the poor. So I started a national ministry called Tech Mission, where we provided free training resources to those serving the poor and the addicted. So by 2008, we had grown fairly quickly. And that was also the year that John Ashman, as president of AJRM, he decided to transfer AJRM's Rescue College to Tech Mission. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the history, Rescue College originally started in 1998 as a one-year program to train rescue mission workers. And it was a part of the Association of Gospel Rescue Missions. It got accredited in 2005, but it wasn't really sustainable within AJRM because it only had about 30 students. So when we took it over, we renamed it to Citygate University, and we've grown it to about 250 students and have added many more programs. And, we started the university. It was founded by rescue missions, for rescue missions originally, but we've grown it to largely serve Christian organizations that serve the poor and the addicted more in general. So, in this talk, I'm going to be talking about the changing generational composition of the workforce. And you can see in this, you have over here the different generations and the birth year based on those. And the primary focus of my talk is going to be on generation X and Generation Y, largely because that's where our students come from. Almost 90% of our students come from those two generations. And I know many of you are in organizations that are transitioning leadership from boomers to younger generations. And what this chart really shows is what portion of the workforce is coming from various generations. So in 2020, the workforce is Gen Y, Gen X, and baby boomers, Gen Y, sometimes called millennials. The millennials are going to be increasing. Right now, Gen X is largely taking over a lot of the executive positions. But more than just talking about, these generational differences of just traits and, tips on how do you manage different generations, I want to talk about the societal changes that are happening across generations, because I think that's the bigger factor to think about as executive directors. So I'm a big picture person, so I'm going to start with a big picture context. So many people have divided history into the agricultural age, the industrial age. And part of the reason why I want to frame this is I think that the rescue mission movement, what I call the rescue mission movement 1.0, really was in a response to addressing some of the problems with the industrial age of urbanization and alcoholism. And now we live in the information age, and we have these new problems: mass addiction, breakdown of the family. And Alvin Toffler, one of the main people who has popularized this term and this framing, he was a futurist, and he said that, in this transition, many of our social institutions will break down, and it's going to be the job of future generations to address that. To put that in more biblical terms, I think that we're living in a time kind of like Matthew 24, where all these are the beginning of birth pains. And these are birth pains of what God's plans are for. And I believe that, God speaks to each generation the words he spoke to Esther. You were made for such a time as this. So each generation is made for such a time as this. And the question is, what is the unique role for each generation to play? Now, I often like to think about City Vision as a role as a university with the rescue mission movement and with other ministries serving the poor as an innovation hub, similar to the relationship that Stanford has had with Silicon Valley. Now, the problem that you have whenever you use the word innovation, sometimes ministry people will get worried that you might try to change things that shouldn't change. You might try to add a fourth person to the Trinity, or things along those lines. So, there's the question of what can change and what remains the same across generations for ministry. And the best book I've read that addresses this is Tim Keller's book, Center Church. And he presents a framework where he says you have what to believe, the doctrinal foundations. And these are the timeless truths from the Bible about God and our relationship to him and his purposes. So, you're not going to change your theology. You're not going to, make a significant change to your statement of faith or change your basic theology. But there's how we see the theological vision, which he defines as a faithful reinstatement of the gospel with rich implications for life, ministry, and mission at a particular culture at a moment in history. Now, as generations change, the culture is changing and the time in history is changing. And he says that you're going to have vision and values, ministry DNA, philosophy of ministry, and different emphases that are going to change. And for this talk, I'm going to talk a lot about the differences in emphases. But then there's what you do. So that might be, programs that you do. And a lot of what we focus on at City Vision is helping people run their programs more effectively. What are the latest programs? But we need to be thinking about this philosophical foundation. So all of this is more theoretical. So let me use a more concrete example of how you might create a new theological vision, new emphases. How do you create a new wineskin for doing a similar, core mission? So as I mentioned, I got started at City Union Mission in Kansas City, and one of their amazing stories is the stories they had a ministry to prostitutes, and a madam, Annie Chambers, was someone that they ministered to, and she became a Christian. And she gave her brothel to City Union Mission to actually become a part of the ministry. And it's an amazing story. But now if you look at what younger generations are really passionate about, is they're very passionate about sex trafficking ministry. So addressing the problems with sex trafficking. And there's so much energy that goes towards this. And in many ways, this is a reframing of the old approach, but with different values, different emphases. And I've seen some of the top ministry leaders in sex trafficking ministries, and the challenge is they're trying to start up these new ministries, but they're under-resourced. And, many thought they had to do it on their own rather than working with a rescue mission. And part of what I want to talk about in this is, answer why that might be. Is it appropriate to, reframe things in terms of sex trafficking ministry at rescue missions? I know some of you have already done that, and some of you may be considering that. But how do we make this type of transition? So let me just get in. So that was my introduction. Let me get into the outline. So what are the three key generational cultural value differences? So, there's a lot of ways you can do research. You can go to Google and you can say, what do millennials want? You can say, what do millennials value? You can read books, Managing the Millennials. So that's just for the millennials. You can do this for other generations. Most of this is actually working with hundreds of students and hundreds of organizations. So those are the primary sources that I'm using. And out of those, there's three key generational value differences. The first one is an emphasis on the value of technology, innovation, on entrepreneurship. The second is the value of changing the world while balancing relational and business values. The third is an increased value on diversity. Now, as a tool that I want to use for this talk is a tool called the Organizational Culture Assessment and Instrument, and it's also called Competing Values Leadership. And you can kind of think of this as a Myers-Briggs personality test, but for an organization's culture. It's the most widely used tool in the world to assess organizational culture. And as a university president that works with hundreds of ministries serving the poor and the addicted, this is the most helpful tool I've found probably in the past decade. And it can be used for many things. One is to assess cultural differences between generations. So I'm a tools person. One of my key goals for this talk is that after this, you could use this tool to assess your organization's culture and to think about both your strategy and generational differences. So the way this tool works is it says, how focused is your culture on things internally versus externally? And then how focused is it on being flexible versus being stable? And based on these, you end up with 4 quadrants. So this standard 2x2 grid, and they have a quadrant called the adhocracy. I call it entrepreneurial mindset. And then across the diagonal, there's a tension across the diagonal. So across from that, you have the hierarchy or control mindset, and then you have the ministry mindset, or what they call the clan mindset, and the business mindset, which is the market mindset. Now, I like to translate these into Christian terms. So, often people will use the term, the church gathered or the church scattered. So this is, the church, or it could be a ministry where people are gathered, Christians are gathered, saying not of the world, but in the world, is kind of the spectrum here. But then also you can look at how much are you emphasizing cultural tradition versus cultural relevance as an organization. And that's just trying to translate some of these terms into things that Christians are more familiar with. So one of the main uses of this is this can be used as a strategic planning roadmap. After you assess your culture, you can figure out how do you want to do priorities. So this is actually the assessment for City Vision University. And what we did is we mapped all of our strategic plan priorities to these different quadrants. And then we said, so we have relational goals, entrepreneurial goals, operations and governance goals, and the business and funding goals. And we devoted resources and then the emphases for the year based on the fact that this pink is where we were. And we've been a highly entrepreneurial organization, but as we mature, we need to increase our operations capability. We need to increase our business capacity. And so that's where we're emphasizing that. So all of that's to frame getting into these next couple parts. So as I mentioned, the most common challenge I think I've seen with younger generations and the culture of rescue missions and similar ministries is the younger generations have a stronger value on technology, innovation, and entrepreneurship. And I think that's one of the key value differences I've seen of many of the leaders that I've seen that have a passion for sex trafficking. They just take an incredibly entrepreneurial approach. And the challenge is they need many of the strengths that rescue missions have. I also found this a challenge, for myself whenever I was trying to figure out my spot in rescue missions about 30 years ago. Whenever I was on summer staff there were a lot of people there that didn't know what to do with an engineering student who was entrepreneurial, who kept working at rescue missions. And 30 years ago, I didn't see a place for myself then, but as people in the movement did reach out to me to partner, it ultimately led to me becoming head of City Vision. So what does this look like in terms of this organizational culture assessment? So we have our students map their current organizational culture and their preferred culture. So this is one example result. And what this student basically is saying is that my organization culture is highly focused on hierarchy, bureaucratic, and I'd like for it to be much more innovative, much more relational. And, I know that can be a very theoretical diagram. This cartoon kind of shows this. Instead of risking anything new, let's play it safe by continuing our slow decline into obsolescence. So this might be what this student is thinking. A lot of people who think that their organizations are too bureaucratic feel like this is what's happening in the organization. So now, ultimately, what we're trying to do for a lot of Christian ministries that take the Bible seriously is how do you work to become organizationally innovative but biblically conservative? Some people would say to avoid the risk of secularization, you should avoid all risk. But there's a lot of biblically conservative but innovative organizations. So World Vision, Cru, Saddleback are all examples. Now, if you get unbalanced, you have an organization that you have too many accountants, too many lawyers. If you're familiar with Myers-Briggs, these are the detail-oriented, organized people, the SJs. The risk is that you could become a stifling bureaucracy. You decline from being too risk-averse. And you also, religiously, you might become legalistic. And then the opposite thing could also be a risk is you have too many entrepreneurs. These are the big picture people, the highly flexible people. And the risk is that you have this attitude that all ideas are good ideas. You have catastrophe from too much risk. And religiously, you could get into problems with relativism and liberal syncretism. So how do you do this thing? Just the fact that a lot of the personality types that like to be in this quadrant might have these tendencies, and same thing with this quadrant. So how do you become organizationally innovative but biblically conservative? So one is to recruit strong Christian entrepreneurs who value the other quadrant. So get really good Christian entrepreneurs who value the Bible. A second thing is to expand your social enterprise programs. The third is if you're going to innovate, you also have to provide strong training in the Bible and other quadrants. So just because you're going to innovate doesn't mean that you have to stop doing the other quadrants. So let me use a couple examples. So one of our students, Jeff Cook, he has an amazing story. He started as a restaurant entrepreneur, was extremely successful. He came into the Springs Rescue Mission to lead their social enterprise division, helped them develop a catering business that won many awards and became over $500,000 of business. And they also developed several other social enterprises. And now he's working with us to take a cohort of leaders through a leadership development process. And what's happened in that organization is he moved from the head of social enterprise now to one of the top people in the organization. So he's bringing entrepreneurship into the whole culture of the organization. Another example is Van Ellison, and he's president and CEO of St. Matthew's House. And they're an amazingly innovative organization. Over 60% of their budget comes from social enterprises, including over half of their 240 employees. And whenever you're leading an organization like that, it's a little bit like trying to herd cats. And, how do you do that? Well, part of what he's done is he's partnered with City Vision to outsource a lot of his training. He's sent us over 40 students in the past few years, and we help train them in the values and help, ensure that they're entrepreneurial, but also are strong across other quadrants. So that is, just a quick overview around the entrepreneurial value. Let me jump into the second value, which is changing the world while balancing relational and business value. So if you ask Google what millennials want, they want to change the world, sustainable companies, purpose-driven companies, corporate social responsibility. They want both of these things. So to put this into competing values, they want you to have business values, but they also want it to make a difference. So, one of the things I've seen over the past 20 years is that previous generations, this hasn't been a both and, this has been an either or. It's been a culture war where you've had these two different mindsets. And I've seen students from a business background judging these ministry people as soft and, vice versa. And one of the things we do at City Vision is try to bridge this divide. So, this side here is basically they have the vision of ministry as family. And this is the ministry people, the counselors. Often these ministries are really good at indigenous leadership development. This side here is best practices of the business world. And it's, a business background. And, again, Myers-Briggs, this is the thinkers, the organized thinkers. This is the feelers and the flexible feelers. Often they focus more on outside hires. And each side has risks. So the business people say, might accuse them of being risk of nepotism or being in a holy huddle or a Christian bubble. Or they may say you're not balancing the budget well and you're in financial decline, or you might create Christian tribalism. Whereas the ministry people, criticizes the other side saying that you're just creating this culture where the whole thing's a business. and you're gentrifying the ministry, you're diluting culture through growth. So the question is, what do you do? How do you avoid this tension? Well, one of our approaches is to provide cross-cultural ministry training to staff from a business background. They just need the language of this side. They need to be able to understand this side, and this side needs to understand the business skills. So whenever we train people, that's what we do. And then ultimately, what I think you need to do is you need to have your senior managers, the people who get promoted are those who are, bivocational and bilingual. And whenever I mean bivocational, I mean they could be a minister, they could be in the business world in many ways. So as a summary of parts 1 and 2 of this talk, basically what I'm saying is, on average, a lot of these large ministries that have been around for a long time, like rescue missions, need to be moving towards being more entrepreneurial. And then across this other quadrant, you have the ministry and business. And ultimately what you need to do there is establish a balance that's going to fit your particular organization and your leadership, but try to avoid having one or the other. So with that, I'm going to focus on the last shift in values, is the increase in values and diversity. And this next chart I'm going to show you is probably the most important chart that I'm going to show you. So this was from a marketing firm, and they looked at what are the differences between generations on social issues. And I realize there's a lot of data on this slide, but for racial equality, Gen Z and millennials, racial equality is a much bigger deal. Same thing with gender equality, same thing with sexual orientation. And, today donations are primarily driven by boomers. So the real pressure hasn't, yet happened in terms of fundraising. For a lot of organizations that uphold the traditional biblical view on marriage and sexuality, it's going to be increasingly important to improve the racial and gender diversity of leaderships to appeal to Gen X, Millennial, and Gen Z donors. So let's talk, and I'm going to focus and do a deeper dive on the racial equality that's been such a big issue in the news this past year, and really, for the past U.S. history, right? So U.S. demographic trends. So over time, the proportion of the population that is non-Hispanic white alone is decreasing to 43%. If you go to the major cities, a lot of cities like Detroit, the white population is only 10%, or in Atlanta, it's 40%, or Miami, it's 13%. Now, I want to stop and talk a little bit about what this really means. So what's happening in a lot of ministries is you're getting people who are growing up in these cities that are really different. So, myself, my own story, I grew up attending white evangelical churches and schools and black churches. I grew up in a racially mixed neighborhood. My spiritual formation in ministry came partly through the mentorship of rescue missions and some amazing mentors, and partly through CCDA in the black church. But for Tech Mission, the parent organization of City Vision, for most of our history, about 2/3 of our staff and board have been black and Latino. There were seasons where I was the only white person. And to me, that just felt normal. Over the past few years, though, the challenge has been, I feel like I have two divorced parents that won't talk to each other. I remember the good old days whenever John Perkins was a keynote speaker at Promise Keeper events on racial reconciliation, and racial reconciliation was considered cool back then. But now you say the words racial reconciliation, and the far right accuses you of imposing critical race theory on them, and the far left says it's a term that's too slanted towards white people, because you have this political polarization. But the reality is that many more young people and younger generations are growing up in this type of environment with more racial diversity in other generations. And one of our top strengths at City Vision has been helping others grow in their cultural intelligence to deal with the reality of this world. So, one of my favorite quotes is, "The future is already here, but it's not evenly distributed." It often applies to technology, but it also applies to demographic changes. So there's kind of a question of, where are you on this curve in terms of the demographic changes? So are you on the great need for change side? You might be in Atlanta, Miami, Detroit, San Francisco, South Africa, where the majority of your clients are of different race, ethnicity of leadership. The extended community in your city might be of a different racial ethnic group than the leadership. And you might be in an environment where younger donors, including evangelicals in your region, strongly value diversity in leadership. You might have less immediate need. You might be in Montana where, 90% of the population that you're serving is, coming from a poor white background. There may be limited differences in leadership and clients, and the extended communities, white and conservative, and the donors in your region don't place significant value on diversity. And ultimately, this isn't just driven by donors, and organizations should make changes according to its core values, regardless of the external pressures. So what I want to do is talk about some case studies of how different organizations that have been on this great need for change side of things, how they've adapted, because over time, many more of you are going to be moving over here. So InterVarsity is one of the most interesting case studies. So InterVarsity serves largely on secular college campuses that are racially diverse and are more left-leaning. They made strategic choices to strongly promote gender equality and racial equality. But they also developed policies to clearly affirm traditional view on marriage and sexuality. So some of the implications of that. So InterVarsity Press became a global leader on evangelical racial dialogue, but also they had, caught some flack. They were banned from meeting on several campuses, at leftist campuses, and that created social stigma for the InterVarsity chapters, and it limited their recruitment because of their stand on marriage and sexuality. And some InterVarsity chapters at leftist campuses left InterVarsity. So another case study is I spent a summer in 1993 at Cape Town City Mission while apartheid was still being dismantled. I visited them about 15 years later, and their context was the leadership was white as apartheid was ended. But they're going through a radical change of cultural norms in post-apartheid South Africa. And the dominant culture all of a sudden shifted where it viewed white-led missions as a colonial mentality and decided to stop supporting organizations that were disproportionately white in their leadership. So they made some strategic choices. They transitioned from white leadership. Many of their programs either were ended or became independent. And they dramatically increased their focus on systemic change. And they saw some fruit from that. So they by moving from charity focus to systemic focus, whenever I was there, I worked at a shelter for street children. And the thing I kept thinking is there are only enough beds for 50 street children largely in the whole city. And there's about 10,000 street children on the street every night. So what they did is, they said charity is not going to solve this by itself. So they created a systemically focused partnership with the city that reduced the number of street children to only 800 children on the street. So solving the problem before it occurs, essentially, is what they did. Now, another case study is Tech Mission. Tech Mission is the parent organization of City Vision University. We were a AmeriCorps national grantee until 2013. We were a national leader in racial diversity in the entire AmeriCorps program, probably had the best diversity out of any AmeriCorps grantee nationally. Despite that, we were targeted by the Obama administration for defending religious hiring rights of evangelical AmeriCorps sites. And ultimately, we had to make some strategic choices. So what we did is we walked away from 75% of our funding rather than compromise our religious hiring rights. We stopped taking direct government grants, and we pivoted our funding model from 75% donor income to 75% earned income. Now, some of this, part of what I learned also was, there's a lot of people who cautioned me about taking government funds. And, I probably shouldn't have ignored the cautions that were there. And I think it's becoming increasingly challenging. So in summary, just the summary of this talk, putting it in the framework that I presented before, what we're trying to do is to think about how we change, how we see as the generations change. So there's three increased emphases: increased emphasis on entrepreneurship, increased emphasis on balanced relational and business values, and increased emphasis on diversity. Now, the last thing I want to say is I would strongly encourage you to check out our website, cityvisioninstitute.org. If you would like to conduct a free organizational culture staff or assessment with your organization, we have an assignment that you could send to your staff. I've taken my staff through it. I've recommended this to many organizations, and we've had a lot of our students take the staff through there, where you could take your organization through this process, and gives you a very practical takeaway from this. So with that, I hope you found this talk helpful, and please help spread the word on this talk and share it with others. Thanks.